My sister Emma's engagement party was supposed to be perfect. She'd been planning it for months, obsessing over every detail from the ivory tablecloths to the specific shade of blush roses that would complement her ring. The venue was our family's old Victorian house, the one where we'd grown up, where every creaking floorboard held a memory, and every room whispered stories of our childhood. Emma had transformed the backyard into something out of a fairy tale, with string lights cascading from the oak trees and mason jars filled with wildflowers lining the wooden tables. She looked radiant in her flowing emerald dress, her auburn hair swept up in loose curls, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine happiness lighting up her green eyes. Her fiancé, Michael, stood beside her like he'd won the lottery, which honestly, he had. Emma was the golden child, the one who'd sailed through life collecting achievements like souvenirs, while the rest of us struggled to keep our heads above water. I should have been happy for her. Really, I should have. But standing there in my borrowed navy dress, watching her accept congratulations from relatives who barely acknowledged my existence, I felt that familiar ache settling in my chest. The one that reminded me I was the spare daughter, the afterthought, the one who'd never quite measured up to Emma's natural brilliance. She was 26, a successful marketing executive with her own apartment in the city, while I was 24 and still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. She had Michael, who looked at her like she hung the moon, while I'd just gotten out of another relationship that ended because I wasn't ready to commit. Everything came so easily to Emma, and everything felt like an uphill battle for me. The party was in full swing when Dad tapped his champagne glass with a silver spoon, calling for everyone's attention. The backyard fell silent, except for the soft jazz playing from the speakers hidden among the roses. About 40 people had gathered, a mix of family, childhood friends, and Michael's relatives who'd driven down from Boston for the occasion. Dad stood at the head of the longest table, his salt and pepper hair perfectly combed, wearing the charcoal suit he reserved for special occasions. He had that commanding presence he'd always possessed, the one that made people listen when he spoke, the one that had served him well in his 30 years as a federal prosecutor. Mom sat to his right, her hands folded in her lap, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'd noticed she'd been quieter than usual all evening, more distant, but I'd attributed it to her typical party anxiety. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," Dad began, his voice carrying across the yard with practiced authority. "Emma, you look absolutely beautiful, sweetheart. And Michael, welcome to our crazy family." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Emma beamed, reaching for Michael's hand as he squeezed her shoulder affectionately. "I remember when Emma was 7 years old," Dad continued. "She told me she was going to marry a prince someday. Well, honey, you found your prince, and he found his princess." More awes from the crowd, and I felt my stomach turn slightly at the saccharine sweetness of it all. But then Dad's expression shifted, became more serious, and something cold settled in the pit of my stomach. "Before we toast to Emma and Michael's future," he said, his prosecutor voice emerging, sharp and deliberate, "I need to address something that's been weighing on our family for far too long." The backyard seemed to hold its breath. Emma's smile faltered, confusion creeping across her features. Michael's arm tightened protectively around her waist. Mom's face had gone completely white, and she was staring at Dad with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure terror. "You see?" Dad continued, his eyes scanning the crowd with laser focus. "Not everyone here tonight is who they claim to be. In fact, someone at this very table has been living a lie for over 2 decades. The silence was deafening. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, could feel the confused and uncomfortable energy radiating from our guests. Aunt Sarah shifted in her seat. Uncle Tom cleared his throat nervously, and Emma's college friends exchanged worried glances. 23 years ago, Dad said, his voice growing stronger, more commanding. A crime was committed that changed our family forever. A crime that some people thought they could bury, thought they could hide behind smiles and family dinners and graduation parties. He paused, letting his words sink in, and I saw Mom's hands begin to tremble. "Well, tonight, the truth comes out. Tonight, we finally get justice." That's when he said it. The words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family, about my life, about who I was. "If anyone tries to leave before I'm finished," Dad announced, his eyes finding Mom's terrified face across the table, "call the police, because the woman sitting right there, The woman you all know as my loving wife and devoted mother is actually a kidnapper, a fraud, and a fugitive from justice. The collective gasp from our guests was audible, like all the air had been sucked out of the backyard at once. Emma's face went chalk white, and she gripped Michael's hand so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. Several people started to stand, confused and alarmed, but Dad held up his hand. Please, everyone, stay seated. What I'm about to tell you will explain everything. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, as Dad's words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I stared at Mom, searching her face for some sign that this was an elaborate joke, a misunderstanding, anything but the truth that was apparently about to unravel our entire existence. But Mom wasn't laughing or protesting or doing any of the things an innocent person would do. Instead, she sat frozen, her face a mask of resignation, like someone who'd been waiting for this moment for 23 years and had finally run out of places to hide. Her lips moved silently, and I realized she was whispering, "I'm sorry," over and over again, though whether to us or to some invisible presence, I couldn't tell. In 1998, Dad continued, his prosecutor voice now in full command, Diana Walsh was a troubled young woman living in Portland, Oregon. She was addicted to heroin, bouncing between shelters and halfway houses, with a history of petty theft and prostitution charges. What most people didn't know was that Diana had a daughter, a 3-year-old girl named Sophie, who was living with Diana's mother while Diana tried to get clean. I felt like I was watching this unfold from outside my body, like I was floating above the backyard watching some stranger's family implode. Diana's mother, Margaret Walsh, was 68 years old and struggling with early-stage dementia. She was barely capable of caring for herself, let alone a toddler. Social services had been called multiple times by concerned neighbors. Emma finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Dad, what are you talking about? What does this have to do with Mom?" But even as she asked the question, I could see the pieces beginning to click together in her mind, the same horrible realization that was forming in mine. Mom's real name wasn't Susan Mitchell. It was Diana Walsh. And if there was a 3-year-old girl named Sophie in this story, then one of us wasn't who we thought we were. On October 15th, 1998, Dad continued relentlessly, Margaret Walsh suffered a massive stroke and was rushed to the hospital. She died 3 days later, leaving Sophie effectively orphaned. Diana was supposed to collect her daughter from the hospital, but she never showed up. The nurses waited. Social services waited. No one could find Diana Walsh anywhere. "Ma," he paused, his eyes moving between Emma and me with an expression I couldn't read. That's because Diana Walsh had stolen the identity of a woman named Susan Mitchell, a cancer patient who had died in a different hospital the same week. Diana took Susan's social security number, her birth certificate, everything. She assumed Susan's identity, created a fake background, and disappeared. The pieces were falling into place now, and I felt sick to my stomach as I began to understand what Dad was really saying. Mom, Diana, had abandoned her first daughter and stolen someone else's identity to start over. But that still didn't explain how she'd ended up married to Dad, how she'd become the mother Emma and I had known our entire lives. Unless one of us was Sophie. Unless one of us was the daughter she'd left behind. I met Susan, Diana, in Chicago in 1999, Dad continued, and now his voice carried a weight of personal pain that made him sound older, more fragile. She was working as a waitress, told me she was starting over after a difficult divorce. She was beautiful, charming, seemed vulnerable in a way that made me want to protect her. We dated for 8 months before I proposed. I thought I was the luckiest man alive. Mom's tears were flowing freely now, silent rivers down her cheeks, but she still hadn't said a word. We got married in Las Vegas, just the two of us. Simple, romantic, or so I thought. 9 months later, Emma was born. Emma made a small, choked sound, and I saw the relief flood her face as she realized she wasn't the abandoned child in this story, which meant it was me. I was Sophie Walsh. I was the daughter who'd been left behind in a hospital 23 years ago, while my mother reinvented herself and started a new family. The daughter who'd been forgotten, erased, replaced by the perfect life Diana had built with my father. 2 years after Emma was born, Dad continued, his eyes now locked on mine with an expression of infinite sadness. Diana told me she wanted another child. She said she'd always dreamed of having 2 daughters. What I didn't know was that she already had a daughter. What I didn't know was that she'd been tracking Sophie through the foster care system for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. My vision was swimming, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling over. Diana convinced me we should adopt. She said there were so many children who needed homes, that we had so much love to give. She researched agencies, filled out paperwork, made all the arrangements. And somehow, through what I thought was an incredible coincidence, we were matched with a 4-year-old girl who was the perfect addition to our family. The backyard was completely silent now, except for the sound of Mom's quiet sobbing and the distant hum of traffic from the street. Our guests sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to be witnesses to this level of family destruction. Emma was staring at me with wide, horrified eyes, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to process what this meant for us, for our relationship, for everything we'd believed about our family. "I adopted Sophie Walsh," Dad said, his voice breaking slightly on my real name, never knowing that the woman I loved, the woman I'd married, was actually her biological mother. Never knowing that Diana had orchestrated the entire thing to get her daughter back, without having to admit who she really was, or what she'd done. The silence that followed Dad's revelation was broken only by the sound of someone's chair scraping against the patio stones as they shifted uncomfortably. I could feel 40 pairs of eyes on me, studying my face, trying to see if they could detect any resemblance to the woman I'd called Mom my entire life. But I couldn't focus on them. Couldn't think about anything except the crushing weight of the truth settling over me like a suffocating blanket. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, my place in this family, my entire existence, had been built on a lie so elaborate and twisted that I couldn't even begin to process it. "How did you find out?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. She was still holding Michael's hand, but I could see the distance growing between them. The way trauma has of making you feel utterly alone, even when surrounded by people who love you. Dad's face was etched with pain as he pulled a manila folder from beneath his chair, the kind of folder that contained official documents and life-changing revelations. 3 months ago, I was contacted by a private investigator named Robert Chen, Dad explained, opening the folder with shaking hands. He'd been hired by the Walsh family attorney to locate Sophie Walsh as part of settling Margaret Walsh's estate. Apparently, Margaret had left a substantial inheritance to her granddaughter, but Sophie had been missing for over 2 decades. When Mr. Chen traced the adoption records and discovered that I had adopted a Sophie Walsh in 2001, he reached out to verify her identity. Dad pulled out a photograph, old and slightly faded, showing a small girl with dark curls and serious eyes standing next to an elderly woman in front of a house I didn't recognize. "This is you at age 3, standing with your grandmother Margaret outside her house in Portland. This photo was taken 6 months before she died." I stared at the photograph, searching for some spark of recognition, some buried memory that would confirm what Dad was telling me. The little girl in the picture had my eyes, my stubborn chin, but I felt nothing looking at her. No connection, no sudden flood of recovered memories, just a hollow ache where my sense of self used to be. "I don't remember any of this," I whispered, and Dad nodded sadly. "You were so young when Diana left you at the hospital, and then you spent a year in foster care before we found you. The trauma, the disruption, it's not uncommon for children to block out those early memories as a survival mechanism." He pulled out more documents, official-looking papers with government seals and legal signatures. But Mr. Chen had DNA evidence, medical records, everything needed to prove beyond doubt that you are Sophie Margaret Walsh, the granddaughter of Margaret Walsh, and the biological daughter of Diana Walsh. "Mom," Diana finally spoke, her voice hoarse from crying. "I never meant for it to happen this way," she said, looking directly at me for the first time since Dad's announcement began. "I was so young, so lost. I made terrible choices, but I never stopped loving you. Every day for 3 years, I thought about you, wondered if you were safe, if you were happy. When I found out you were in foster care, when I learned that you weren't thriving, I knew I had to find a way to bring you home." "Home?" I stood up so abruptly that my chair fell backward, clattering against the patio stones. "This isn't my home. This whole life is a lie. You kidnapped me from my own life and made me live a fantasy where you got to be the perfect mother who never abandoned her child." The words came out harsh and angry, powered by a rage I didn't even know I possessed. You let me grow up thinking I was adopted by strangers who chose to love me, when really you were just cleaning up the mess you made when you walked away from your responsibilities. Emma tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, suddenly unable to bear the thought of anyone touching me. And what about me? I continued, my voice rising. What about the fact that I spent 23 years calling you Mom, thinking you were this amazing woman who saved me from a broken system, when really you were the one who broke me in the first place? What about the fact that I have a whole family, a whole history, a whole identity that you stole from me? Sophie, Dad said gently, but I whirled around to face him. Don't call me that. I don't even know who Sophie is. I'm Alexis. I've always been Alexis, except apparently that's not even real either. I could feel myself spiraling, could feel the edges of my reality crumbling away like sandcastles at high tide. Did you know? I demanded, studying his face for any sign of deception. When you married her? When you adopted me? Did you know what she'd done? Dad's face crumpled, and in that moment, he looked every one of his 58 years. I swear to you, Alexis, I had no idea. When Mr. Chen first contacted me, I thought there had been some mistake. I hired my own investigator to verify his findings because I couldn't believe the woman I'd loved for 24 years could be capable of something like this. I spent weeks hoping he was wrong, praying there was some other explanation. He gestured to the folder still lying open on the table. But the evidence is overwhelming. DNA tests, fingerprint matches, medical records that prove you're Sophie Walsh beyond any shadow of doubt. The weight of it all was crushing. Not only had my entire identity been a lie, but Dad had been living with this knowledge for months, watching me go about my daily life completely unaware that everything was about to change. How long were you planning to keep this secret? I asked, and something in my voice made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. I wasn't, Dad said firmly. I've been working with the FBI for the past 2 months to build a case against Diana. Tonight was supposed to be the night we finally told you the truth, but I wanted to do it privately, after the party. I wanted you to have one more normal evening with your family before everything changed forever. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad had chosen Emma's engagement party, a celebration of new beginnings and happy futures, to reveal that my entire existence had been built on the ashes of someone else's crime. As I looked around at the faces of our guests, I could see the mixture of fascination and horror that comes with witnessing someone else's private devastation played out in public. This was the kind of story people would tell for years, the kind of family drama that would be whispered about at holiday gatherings and shared in hushed tones over coffee dates. The FBI has been building a case against Diana for identity theft, fraud, and child abduction, Dad continued, his prosecutor instincts taking over as he laid out the facts with methodical precision. Tomorrow morning, she'll be arrested and formally charged. There will likely be a trial, media attention, and a lengthy legal process to sort out all the ramifications of what she's done. He looked at me with eyes full of pain and love. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before it became public record, before reporters started calling and strangers started asking questions about your life. Diana had stopped crying and was now sitting perfectly still, staring at her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, like a deflated balloon slowly losing the last of its air. I know you'll never forgive me, she said quietly, her words directed at me but somehow meant for everyone present. I know I destroyed everything good in my life because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. But I need you to know that every day I was your mother, every birthday, every bedtime story, every scraped knee I kissed better, every proud moment at your school plays and graduation, all of that love was real. My feelings for you, my pride in the woman you've become, that was never fake. But it was all built on a lie, I said, my voice steadier now, though I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. Every I love you, every family tradition, every moment where I felt grateful to have been chosen by such a wonderful family, it was all contaminated by the truth you were hiding. I turned to Emma, who had been silent through most of this exchange, processing her own shock and trying to understand what this meant for our relationship. And what about Emma? Does she get to keep her perfect life while I have to rebuild everything from scratch? Does she get to stay Daddy's little girl while I become the living reminder of his wife's crimes? Emma finally spoke, her voice stronger than I expected. This doesn't change anything between us, she said firmly. You're still my sister. You're still the person who taught me how to French braid my hair, and who stayed up all night with me when I had mono, and who helped me practice my valedictorian speech until I could recite it in my sleep. Biology doesn't erase 20 years of being sisters. But it changes everything else, I replied, feeling the full weight of what my future looked like starting to settle in. I have to figure out who Sophie Walsh is supposed to be. I have to learn about Margaret Walsh, about the life I would have had if Diana hadn't decided to rewrite history. I have to deal with lawyers and reporters and probably therapists who specialize in recovered memory and identity trauma. I laughed, but it came out bitter and sharp. I have to grieve for a grandmother I never knew I had, for a life that was stolen from me before I was old enough to even understand what I was losing. Dad cleared his throat, and I could see he was struggling to maintain his composure. There's something else, he said, pulling another document from the folder. Margaret Walsh's estate, the inheritance Mr. Chen mentioned. It's substantial, Alexis. Margaret owned her house outright, had savings, investments, life insurance. She left everything to her granddaughter, to you. After taxes and legal fees, you're looking at close to $300,000. The number hung in the air like a foreign concept. I'd been working part-time jobs and struggling to pay rent on my studio apartment, and now I was suddenly supposed to be a person who inherited money from family members I'd never met. I don't want it, I said immediately. It feels like blood money, like I'm profiting from Diana's crimes. It's your birthright, Dad said gently. Margaret worked her whole life and saved that money specifically for you. She died not knowing what happened to you, but she never gave up hope that someday you'd be found. That money represents her love for you, her faith that you were still alive somewhere. As the evening wound down, and guests began to awkwardly excuse themselves, unsure of proper etiquette for leaving an engagement party that had turned into a confession of decades-old crimes, I found myself sitting alone at one of the smaller tables, staring up at the string lights Emma had hung so carefully just hours before. Michael had taken Emma inside to call off their honeymoon plans and figure out how to handle the inevitable media attention that would follow tomorrow's arrest. Dad was on the phone with his FBI contact, making final arrangements for Diana's surrender. Diana approached me slowly, moving like someone walking to their own execution. "Can I sit with you for a minute?" she asked, and I nodded, too emotionally exhausted to refuse. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of Dad's phone conversation and the clatter of dishes being cleared from the other tables. "I know this doesn't matter now," Diana finally said, "but I want you to know that getting you back was never about fixing my mistakes. It was about love. Broken, selfish, destructive love. But love, nonetheless. You were the best thing I ever did, even when I was doing it all wrong. Tomorrow, my life as Alexis Mitchell would effectively end, and my journey to discover who Sophie Walsh was supposed to be would begin. But tonight, sitting under Emma's fairy lights with the woman who had been my mother for 23 years, I allowed myself to grieve for the family I was losing, even as I tried to imagine the family I might someday find.